The last car I had when I lived in Sweden was a Volvo. Volvo is a Latin name. It means I'm rolling. And today I'm going to talk about a medical condition that's really not a diagnosis, but a symptom. That is also a Latin word that ends with O. Vertigo. And vertigo loosely translated means I'm spinning or I'm twirling. And it is an illusion of a movement. And speaking of cars, you can have an illusion of movement, at least I have that. If I'm sitting in the car in a parking lot and another car pulls in or pulls out next to me, I sometimes get the sense that they're standing still and I'm the one moving. So our sense of movement generally comes from our inner ear, which has an organ in it called the otolith organ that is right next to the hearing organ. But sometimes you can have a sense of movement from visual impressions or even from brain problems otherwise. And dizziness that has a sensation of movement can be three different diagnoses commonly that arise in the inner ear. You can have an inner ear infection, which is less common than people think, labyrinthitis. They usually last for a few days, and it can be very disabling when it happens. You can also have a recurring type of dizziness or vertigo that is associated with hearing loss, and that's called Meniere's disease, where the viral infection attacks the nerve cells that register movement. Meniere's disease is a consequence of a pressure buildup that suddenly lets go when something bursts inside the balance organ. But the most common form of dizziness that is recurring is something that in this country doesn't have a very catchy name. It's called benign positional vertigo. The Swedes have a much better name for it. Their names in Sweden are folksier. They call it the crystal disease. And vertigo very often means the crystal disease. So let me start by saying a little bit about how the inner ear hearing organ works. It's called the otolith organ. And so bear with me. I don't have any graphs. I don't think that makes it much easier to understand. There is a three-part system, like a cave, with three different parts in it. This cave is filled with a thick fluid, sort of like hydraulic fluid. In the bottom of this cave is a part called the otolith organ. And in it are nerve cells with little hairs that stand up. And those hairs can move if I move forward or back. But that's a very subtle movement. So in order to make that little movement register better, like if my car starts rolling, for example, in order to make that movement more noticeable, each of these little nerve cells in the otolith organ has a little rock or a little crystal sitting on top of it. That exaggerates the movement of the little nerve hairs when a person moves. The main part of the balance organ is three circular or semicircular tubes that register movement in space, different angles of the head, so to speak. At the end of each one of those semicircular canals are little nerve cells with hairs on them. And because these movements are more dramatic than these movements, they don't need a rock on top of them to register that the hydraulic fluid moves. In between these is a storage space of sorts called the saccule. And what happens when we get older, things fall apart. The little rocks, the otoliths, fall off the tips of those nerve cells that register this movement. And through the various movements of our lives, those little rocks, otoliths, can end up not just in the saccule, which is the storage space, but in the semicircular canals. And if we have rocks in one of our semicircular canals and not in the others, if we then tip our head in one ear, we get the appropriate information. We're turning 30 degrees to the left and a little bit forward. But in the other one, if there are rocks floating around in the hydraulic fluid, you get the information and say, oh man, we're upside down. And that creates a sensation that we actually turned upside down until our eyes take in the scenery and figure out that's not true. And then we feel better. The problem then is if these crystals keep doing this again and again, people can experience vertigo, the sensation of movement, when they turn their head a certain way. If we can figure out which head turn causes the problem, then we can actually put people through a series of head movements called the Epley maneuver that can bring those loose crystals back into the storage space, the saccule. If you do it wrong, you get worse. If you do it right, you get worse before you get better, but it's often successful. And sometimes we take dizziness medications, but they're basically antihistamines that make you tired. The dizziness medications are most useful if you have a temporary inner ear viral infection. But with a benign positional vertigo, the medicines are not a long-term solution. The Epley maneuver is. So that is the story behind vertigo. People use vertigo as a diagnosis, but it's a symptom. There can be several diagnoses leading to that symptom. And I still like the Swedish word better, the crystal disease, because that helps you immediately remember what's causing it.